Good morning, everybody. Imbues have been in the game for a little while now, and so the real question is, how good are they? Exactly how good are the different imbues? How are you supposed to use them? What character classes use them the best? And these are all important questions. But pretty much the main question I want to tackle today is, well, how good are they? Because if you maximize the imbue dice on a character, is it always going to be the best way to do it? And what are the best ways to maximize imbue dice? You see, I have this character here. It's a Sacred Fist, who has a cool imbue where they add like light damage to their fists and they get to punch, punch, punch and do a bunch of extra damage. Well, they also get to scale their imbue dice through other class abilities, such as Ranger with Arcane Archer or with Rogue with their Poisoned Blade. I took both of those things, getting a huge amount of extra imbue dice, and tried to focus all in on the imbue dice to see exactly how it would go. Overall, my results were essentially that, yeah, it was pretty good. Turns out just having a whole bunch of extra damage added per hit is really strong, so I can't really complain about that. However, there were a couple areas where my imbue dice fell short, and this is where I think picking your imbue is probably one of the most important part of the imbue dice process. You see, I used the Sacred Fist imbue, and the Sacred Fist imbue is very good. It deals light damage, so it bypasses all the immunities, allowing me to just pretty much punch whatever I want to do tons of damage to them. Plus also there are some light vulnerable creatures, but I made a mistake, as it scales off of melee power. Now scaling off of melee power isn't a bad thing. In the endgame, you're going to have tons of melee power. I would posit that most characters, especially if you're going to be melee oriented, will have somewhere around 200 melee power generally, and with 200 melee power, that's a lot and will give you a lot of damage. The problem is that almost all melee power comes in the epics. It's very difficult to get melee power in heroics, and as a result, this character kind of suffered in some of its damage in heroics, whereas if I had a imbue that's scaled off of spell power in heroics, getting spell power is very easy. It comes on items, it comes from your enhancement trees, and it would have been much easier to come by. So in general, my recommendation to you is if you're going to be picking a imbue for heroics, try to pick one that's based off of spell power, because that will be a little bit more helpful generally for your leveling process. Now this character took 3 Ranger and 2 Rogue for the extra imbue dice, being able to pick up 4 additional imbue dice out of the Arcane Archer tree and 3 out of the Assassin tree. Remember, now with the imbue dice, anything that would add damage onto your weapon attack as like a toggle, like the Rogue Assassin's Venom Blades or the Eldritch Knight's Spell Sword, all of the sources of additional damage now stack together. So if I pick up more damage for my Assassin's Blade out of the Assassin tree, that will also increase the damage of my Eldritch Knight attacks. That will also increase the damage of my Sacred Fist imbue. All of the imbues sort of work together. So this 3 Ranger, 2 Rogue is actually something you will see fairly common. It's a very inexpensive way, because it only takes 5 levels, to grab a huge amount of imbue dice, and on top of that, a bunch of good stuff. Rogue gives you access to sneak attack dice, as well as evasion and the ability to disable all the traps in the game. And the 3 Ranger not only gives you the imbue dice out of Arcane Archer, but it also gives you Rapid Shot if you're any type of ranged character. And on top of that, you're also able to pick up 2 Weapon Fighting, which is an extra combat style feat. So if you happen to be like a Inquisitive or a bow character or a thrower, the 2 Weapon Fighting feat will give you more hit points because of how there was the change to hit points earlier in the year, or I guess it was last year at this point, time of recording, giving you even more health. And you still have access to the Deepwood Stalker tree, which for a very small investment gives you a lot of sneak attack damage, as well as a lot of positive spell power, which is pretty much useful for every single character in the game. But that's not all. Even just the 2 Rogue gives you, as I said, evasion, rogue skills, and 3 imbue dice, only for 8 enhancement points. There are a lot of ways to get a huge amount of imbue dice with very small amounts of investment. 3 levels of Alchemist, 3 levels of Sorcerer or Wizard, 3 levels of Cleric or Favored Soul, especially if you go Dark Apostate, since you can get imbue dice both out of the War Priest tree and out of the Dark Apostate tree. There are a lot of ways to get a lot of imbue dice very quickly and very easily. And that's not just talking about in the endgame how many you can get from adding different filigrees or how many you can get from different set bonuses, as well as the different feats, allowing you to use either the Chaotic or Lawful alignment to take Embodiment of Law or Harbinger of Chaos for extra imbue dice, or the Elemental imbue dice feat you can get at 31, or the augments you can get that also give you imbue dice. So the real question is that I want to answer is, how good are imbue dice? And the answer is, in almost all cases, pretty good. There are very few builds that can't benefit from having some imbue dice added into them, so it is always something you should consider how difficult it is to really amp up that section of your build. Now granted, there are definitely some characters that don't benefit as much. As an example would be Barbarian. barbarians get the ability Frenzy, which allows them to deal extra physical damage on their attacks as an imbue. I believe it's a bludgeoning damage imbue. Or is it Bane? I think, no, it's Bane damage. And so the Bane damage is cool because it means that it always deals additional damage, and they can even get imbue dice out of their tree. The problem is you don't really want to focus on the imbue as much, simply because barbarians, since they get such high critical multipliers and extra damage that way, the imbue might be cool, but the second you press Adrenaline while you're in epics, which is a guaranteed crit on your next attack, and then you press something like Boulder's Might, which adds a bunch of critical multiplier on a great axe, all of a sudden you're hitting a monster with a ×7 or ×9 critical and dealing almost 80,000 damage in one hit, and the extra little bit of like 250 damage from the imbue really doesn't matter that much. So some classes, like I said, Barbarian, probably not as impactful, but pretty much every other class in the game, talking about the new Bard imbue that they added, the Artificer imbue, especially with repeating crossbows, the updates and huge buffs to the Inquisitive imbue, even the Arcane Archer imbue, all of these things are super strong. Hell, I've even been tempted to check out new Tempest Ranger, where grabbing the Storm Dancer effect, which allows you to add lightning damage on all of your attacks as a Tempest Ranger, but still dipping into Arcane Archer for the imbue dice just to see exactly how that would go. In my opinion, I think imbue dice were a good change to the game in terms of opening up a lot of cool and weird ways to build your characters. They're also tremendously useful during the early leveling process and mid-leveling process, so that's like level 1 to around level 14, 15 or so, where the extra bit of damage is super helpful. The only area where it starts to slow down a bit is when you get to like the 16 to 20-ish levels, where monsters generally tend to have a little bit more hit points, and it kind of balloons a bit in a non-linear way, where monsters go from, you go, cool, I'm in Giant Hold, I'm fighting the monsters, they have about 600 health, and then you jump into Sharn, and they all have like 2,200. So the imbue dice, because they don't scale, they only scale linearly, it's a little bit harder to make them as effective. However, once you get into epics, you're able to pick up so much more imbue dice out of Primal Avatar, out of Draconic Incarnation, out of Legendary Dreadnought, or picking it up out of Divine Crusader. There are a lot of different ways to get some extra imbue dice right away into your build, and they're just super powerful. A lot of good ways to do that, and I think that for the majority of builds, that is something they can easily invest in. So if you can, give imbue dice a shot, especially once you get, as I said, into the early epics. A lot of people haven't tried Primal Avatar on their melees yet, but Primal Avatar is very, very good. All you have to do is pick the mantle. It applies to all of your weapon attacks, so just grab like a spell power item off of somewhere. Maybe you can get something from the epic item dump that you can get there that came with item 50 or level update 50, or you can get just a couple augments in your weapons, and then get the extra imbue dice, and your character will be absolutely rolling in huge amounts of damage. Now, I didn't actually talk about my build that much, so I'm just going to pass it over to me with the build. Sacred Fist is pretty cool, and so is Shader Kai, being able to boast punch, 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 as well as run the chain attack. You can have some interesting combinations, especially when you maximize your imbues, and that's where we come with the Sacred Fist Ranger Rogue. Now, as I said, this character is not the greatest. It has a lot of different problems. One being charisma-based is kind of bad for this character because it really heavily limits your actual max stat, since you don't take any capstones, and you also don't really have a lot of points to spend on charisma anywhere, so your main stat is a little bit lower than you would expect. On top of that, the imbue damage, it's nice, but because it doesn't critically strike and also scales heavily off of melee power, you get a lot of melee power at the end game and almost none during the leveling process. So while the damage is pretty good in heroics, it doesn't really do a whole lot in the early epics, although later epics it actually is fairly noticeable because of how much melee power you get just by leveling up. Like when I started, I didn't have any melee power, and now I'm at 122, because just by increasing your level, you get 72 melee power, and then you get melee power from your epic destinies. So this character picks up an extra 35 melee power. So over 100 just comes from levels, and that's pretty substantial in an increase in your damage. So generally, this character gets more powerful as you level up, not as great during the leveling process. But I've got all the disabling skills, Disable Device, Search, as well as having enough concentration so I can keep hold of Ki on this character, which is kind of important. Plus, I managed to sneak heal in there for some extra healing spell power. Open Lock, just a bit farther behind because I don't really have any dexterity items to speak of, and I didn't really have any dexterity. Although I do have more dexterity here, so I don't know, it is what it is. In terms of the feats, you're going to be grabbing the combat style feats, so all of the 2-weapon fighting as well as 2-weapon defense, so you can increase your magic resistance rating cap, which is nice for the end game. It's pretty easy to fit in a lot of the feats in here. On top of that, this character also, because you are a Sacred Fist, you get access to the different monk abilities like Monk Armor Class, Evasion, and the like. Now, you might be wondering, of course, why exactly are you taking 3 Ranger and 2 Rogue? It has nothing to do with these feats. It has nothing to do with these spells. It has everything to do with the enhancement trees. By taking 3 Ranger, you can get imbue dice from the Arcane Archer tree here, grabbing imbue dice. You can also grab imbue dice out of Assassin Rogue, add it onto the stuff in Sacred Fist. This is an extra 5, whereas if I was a pure Sacred Fist, I would get only an extra 2. So I'm able to get, 3 more imbue dice over the 2. Now, granted, is that better? Well, this gives 10 melee power. This also gives 4 charisma, so it's probably honestly better to be a pure paladin and not worry about the extra imbue dice and heroics. But I digress. I wanted to test that out and see where it was. I also grabbed Deepwood Stalker here because for 6 points you can easily get some sneak attack die and a lot of positive spell power, so it worked well. And I grabbed the double chains from Shader Kai. And then in Epic Destinies, I went with Primal Avatar. It's pretty much the best melee mantle here, applying a lot of melee damage on each individual attack, as well as guaranteeing imbue dice, which is cool. And I was going to get the imbue dice out of the Draconic Incarnation tree, but then I realized Shadow Dancer gives a bunch of sneak attack dice, improved evasion, and more sneak attack dice, and melee power, and it's just straight up better. It's for this character, it's strictly better to do this, which is kind of disappointing because I wanted to go the other way. And on top of that, also I've got Crusade here for the bonus dice, and also the extra melee damage. So, the question remains, was it worth it? Was it a good idea to do? And my personal answer is probably not. I think that if I had gone pure paladin, I would have a few more spells, so I would have access to Angel Skin, which would give me more defense. I would lose out on 4 sneak attack dice, or 5 sneak attack dice. Obviously, losing out on 5 sneak attack dice and 2 imbue dice is not as good, but you do get to pick up the extra imbue dice here, so you gain 2 here. On top of that, you gain 4 charisma. You'd have more points to spend in other trees, so you'd be able to easily pick up charisma in other places, even if you were playing as like Shader Kai. And you get the melee power here as well. So honestly, in my opinion, I think it probably is better to go as a pure paladin here. I think that maximizing the imbue dice on this character is a bit of a trap. And on top of that, I think that in general, unless you're using a universal tree, you're probably going to find that to be the case. I think right now, Inquisitive, if you decided to play as an Inquisitive, the imbue is extremely powerful. And on top of that, getting the extra dice out of Assassin Rogue is really easy because your character, if you're an Inquisitive, likely will have some Rogue levels. Getting it out of Arcane Archer is really easy because your character likely will have some Arcane Archer or will have some Ranger levels because Inquisitive doesn't really require you to be a pure class. Whereas the Sacred Fist thing does kind of require it. And since I get so many more imbue dice from the epics anyway, I think in general it's probably better to just go with the pure as opposed to multi-classing. That being said, that's all I have for you today on my adventure with imbue dice. If you like what you see here, consider subscribing to the channel so you can get some more videos about character builds and insights into how the game works, about Dungeons & Dragons Online, so I can try the bad stuff so you don't have to. But that's it. Thank you for watching. See you later. Bye-bye.